You're listening to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series,
a dedicated series that explores all things net zero carbon and sustainability within the built environment.
Don't miss any future episodes. Subscribe at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts. Hello and welcome to the latest episode in Place Northwest's COP26 podcast series. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. Today's episode is sponsored by HBD. From its 7 UK offices, HBD takes on ambitious developments across 3 key sectors: industrial and logistics, residential, and urban regeneration. Its Northwest projects include Campus, Manchester's newest neighbourhood, and Island, a next-generation office scheme at the heart of the city. To find out more, visit hbd.co.uk. Today, we will be asking why government legislation in relation to net zero is lagging behind plans of many developers that are taking it upon themselves to get ahead of the curve. We'll also explore the ways in which the term net zero is being used incorrectly and why having a single formalised framework would benefit the industry going forward. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Treanor, Director at Developer HBD, and Paul Kenyon, Partner at multi-disciplinary practice Cundall. Nice to have you both with us. We'll get straight into it then. Paul, I'll start with you. I wonder if you could give us an outline as to what legislation exists currently for developers to follow in relation to developing net zero buildings.
Well, I think particularly in Manchester have got the spatial framework. They set out targets for 2028 to be net zero carbon for new buildings and 2038 for existing buildings to be a net zero carbon. And then you've got, of course, the UK legislation of achieving a net zero carbon nation by 2050, which is the overarching legal requirement that we signed up to, which Theresa May introduced one of the last things she did when she was in power. So that's what's driving the overall sort of industry. And, the UK's construction industry needs to halve, or the property industry needs to halve its emissions, its carbon emissions by 2030. If you look at the science-based trajectory that we're on, that's you think about 8 years, that's a huge step to actually halve all the property and buildings carbon emissions. So it gives you a bit of an idea of where we've got to go to in such a short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think then that these are realistic targets?
Well, certainly they are very challenging targets. Everyone's waking up to the fact that this is a big issue that we all need to resolve between us all. But we are starting to see, with the designs that we're doing for the likes of HBD, that we can achieve the sort of targets that we need to, and we can get ahead of the curve. So it is possible, but we wouldn't want to suggest they're easy in any shape or form.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2028 for new buildings in accordance with the spatial framework. Lee, HBD is developing new office buildings. It's 2021. You have 7 years. That seems like quite a nice little bit of breathing room for you. But as we'll discuss later in the podcast, Island, one of your projects, which will be completed or being well before 2028, is going to be net zero. Again, we'll talk more about that later. So why are developers like HBD and others doing things that realistically they don't have to yet? Why are they ahead of the legislation in that regard?
I think there's a number of strands to that, Dan. I think, developers, like many other organisations, have their own ESG agenda, so they'll have their own targets to reduce their own emissions through, their own occupation and the products that they produce in the market, so the buildings that they produce. So there's an element of organisations wanting to kind of reduce their own carbon footprint. But quite a lot of it is also being driven by the market. So obviously the main thing we're going to talk about today, how is the market driving this, maybe slightly harder than legislation. So from an occupier's point of view, there's been a big shift, I think, in the last few years around companies taking responsibility for their own impact on the environment. And they're being held to account, I think, by their own staff as well. Sort of what does it say about each individual employee in terms of the organisation that they work for and how their values potentially align or maybe don't align. And I think again, organisations coming under pressure from their own clients to say, well, what are you doing? What's your stance on your own ESG agenda and your sustainability credentials? And then beyond the occupier market, there's also the investment market. I think there's been a lot in the press recently about this sort of real sort of pent-up demand for people to place money in sort of more sustainable schemes. Lots of funds talking about green funds and preferential rates for more sustainable products. And I think we're going to come on to it later, but at the moment, if you are, if you're out there trying to place something to for your green or sustainable fund, it could be quite difficult at the moment to find the correct product that you're looking for. So I think it's a number of factors. The other thing I think to think about is also, whilst we are on a pathway and a trajectory, as Paul mentioned, and there are incremental steps between now and 2050, what we're building now will be around potentially 60 years, maybe longer. So what we're looking at on Island and some of our other projects is we're not just looking at the next 5 or 10 years. We're trying to have a look at, well, what would the market demands be for the lifespan of that building? Once a building's developed and let up, it's quite difficult to come back and make wholesale retrospective changes to things like fabric and systems once a building is let up and occupied. So, whilst it can be done and there's a big retrofit to be done across existing properties, it's obviously easier and quicker to do if you can build that into the base build design rather than having to revisit it at a future point.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot said about the flight to quality at the moment. And I guess that ties in with what you said about occupier demand. Occupiers want officers that have these credentials that are in line with their own moral beliefs, essentially. And also the war on talent as well. In a city like Manchester, which has a high retention rate of graduates to universities, there's a lot of competition for staff. How important is net zero officers going to be in that war for talent?
I think one of the two biggest factors that we hear from the occupational market around what they want from, we could call it post-COVID office space or the workspace of tomorrow, is around health and well-being. Is a huge area that occupiers are focusing in on, and that's around the war for talent, staff retention, and just generally, what that says about their own values in the space that they're providing and the environment they're providing for their workforce. But sustainability is the other very big ticket item. So what we're finding is what the market's saying to us is that they will want to provide space for their staff, which is right at the cutting edge in terms of sustainability. So it does align with their own values, but also the staff's value as well. So the general feel is that the market will gravitate towards the most sustainable properties and the lowest energy consuming properties as part of that drive to really just enforce their own sustainability credentials across their own space and their own occupation.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Let's move on then and talk about net zero and what it actually is, because as we know, there's a lot of noise around net zero. The term gets bandied around a lot. And I think a lot of people who aren't deeply entrenched in jobs like yourselves don't actually know what net zero is. It's just kind of a buzzword at this stage, but there is a definition, and Paul, you're going to provide it for us.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. You're very right there, Dan. It is a problem having some consistency in the industry, and in fact, we're helping write the clear definitions for carbon in the built environment for the RIBA and LETI at the moment. And we hear all the different things bandied around. So, for example, we get a lot of, we're carbon neutral. So carbon neutral would be in a situation whereby you carry on with your the way that you conduct yourself and your business as normal. And then you would seek to offset your sort of carbon by purchasing a scheme such as a forestry system or something like that. So, EasyJet, they do this. If you go on their website, they'll tell you that for every flight they offset their emissions by planting trees or something. But the reality is they're not changing their habits, and whilst it's it's a good start, it's not really driving down the carbon and our sort of habits the way we need it to do. So as net zero carbon is actually requiring us to drive our carbon consumption down to a level that's scientifically accepted as protecting the 1.5 degree maximum temperature increase in global warming that we signed up to with the 2050 Paris Agreement. So, the first step is drive down your energy to an acceptable level, and then sort of generate your own renewable energy on site, and then offset off-site by purchasing, green electricity and things like this to get to your net zero situation. And then you do get some people talk about zero carbon, but to use no carbon at all in the construction and operation of buildings, it'd be very, very difficult, impossible. I don't know how you could do that. So yeah, it's something that is needed. We do need to have that clarity. It'll help all of the people that do the right thing be recognised in a consistent way, and for those that try and use a few smoke and mirrors, it'll be harder for them to do that in the future, I think, as we start to clarify the meanings of all these various terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lee, in terms of what Paul just spoke about there with clarity, how is HBD navigating that, and which path are you choosing to take in order to consider yourselves net zero?
Well, one of the challenges we've had on the net zero carbon journey with Ireland is that there is no clearly defined or industry-backed framework. So how to assess net zero carbon. There are a number of different methodologies in the marketplace, but there is no clearly defined one that is that industry leader. So it's difficult then to make sure that you're on a level playing field potentially with other properties as an end user occupier. When you're looking at the different definitions and the figures that you're being quoted, that you are comparing on a like-for-like basis. What we found is that the neighbours rating system, which originates in Australia, is actually now there's a UK version. The industry appears to be gravitating towards that. So what we're finding is that several properties that are slightly more advanced than us in their path on net zero have kind of aligned themselves to the neighbours rating. So we've followed on Ireland with that one. So it's really clearly defined in terms of the way the star ratings are calculated. So it should be really easy for occupiers and investors to kind of judge the sustainable credentials of a property if you're using the neighbours rating. I think the other important point that sort of follows on from that as well is that at the moment, there is probably not a grading system for net zero carbon. So obviously, as Paul said, there are a number of definitions that people are quoting, and what it isn't possible to differentiate at the moment is maybe some properties that are potentially introducing an element of greenwashing and claiming to be net zero carbon, but what those properties are is not necessarily sustainable properties, but they're kind of being propped up maybe by offsetting their embodied and their operational carbon. So I think what there is a need, in the same way that on BREEAM you had the different elements or different ratings. If we had a classification of net zero carbon, maybe where there's a rating system that does highlight how sustainable the building is itself without having the offsetting factored into it. I think that would make it clearer both for occupiers and investors to sort of differentiate between the offerings of competing properties.
Yeah, I think back in the day, when discussion about sustainability was in its infancy, or certainly more primitive than it is now, I think offsetting was seen as a positive thing. But judging by what you've both said, Paul and Lee, it sounds like a kind of a dirty word. Is that fair to say, Paul?
I wouldn't put it like that. I think that it's a good thing to do. Reforestation is a good thing in any case. I think the thing is that because we're looking at such a step change in consumption, because the whole point of this is to reduce the consumption such that it will meet the increase in generation of renewable energy. So the two align. So as a nation, we've got to reduce our consumption to match our renewable generation. And that, if you look at that trajectory of that graph, is extremely steep. It's virtually vertical. So the rate of change is enormous over the time we have left to do this, to protect 1.5 degrees. So it's not a dirty word at all. It's just that it was the start of the journey for us all to start doing that, which is a good thing to do. But really, you do need to get your energy consumption right down to this level that's deemed to be acceptable level for us to be able to match our predicted green generation.
Yeah. So offsetting alone is not enough anymore. It was a good starting point, but we need to be moving past that now and looking at things a bit more discerningly.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think, Dan, as well, we should be looking at offsetting as a sort of last resort once you've explored other opportunities in terms of reducing embodied and operational carbon. It shouldn't be an alternative to good design. It should just be that final piece where you've sort of explored other avenues, and there is still an element of carbon debt to be offset. But yeah, a last resort rather than a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And when occupiers are looking at an office to take this, the need for that established framework that tells them in a simple traffic light system how sustainable that building is required, isn't it? Because at the moment, they could go to a building and the landlord could say, yes, we're carbon neutral or we're net zero, when really they might be bending the truth a little bit. So it's needed for developers. This framework is needed for developers to know which way to go and what to do, but it's also needed for occupiers to make an informed choice as well. Paul, in terms of your clients, how many of them are serious about net zero, and how many of them are looking more towards the offsetting side of things?
I think nearly all of the clients that we're working for at the moment are taking this very seriously, and they want it to be a robust approach that will stand scrutiny. So they are, as Lee was explaining, looking to the UK version of Neighbours, which is designed for performance, which is the Better Buildings Partnership, which contains consultants like ours, but also lots of clients and developers. And the investors and funders are all reviewing their exposure to climate risk. And, you have the likes of the Task Force for Climate Risk and Fiscal Disclosure, which was set up by Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg. So, two very senior guys in the financial world. And they've got they set up a league table for all of the portfolios and funds to sort of measure their risk and exposure to climate change. And so that is one of the things that's driving the whole industry, really, because funding and access to funds is key to any project, really. And so that's driving the behaviour of our clients to take it so seriously. And I think as soon as we saw the likes of TCFD pushing this, I think we knew it was going to be here to stay. This and that direction of travel towards net zero carbon is definitely going to become more and more important.
Yeah, absolutely. It does thankfully feel like it's irreversible now. Lee, are you seeing the same kind of buy-in from people that you speak to and people that you work with?
Absolutely. I think I haven't spoken to a potential occupier or a consultancy or fellow developers who aren't looking at this seriously now. I think with COP26 coming up, there'll obviously probably be some large announcements there around potential future government legislation or tightening of measures, but I don't think anybody's under any illusion that this is going away. I think it's an issue that's at the forefront of everybody's mind, and one that is being taken very seriously. And I think you'll see that in the next phase of developments that come through, and the difference in the energy consumption, sustainability of the next phase of new build buildings compared to the properties that have come through maybe in the past 10 or so years, historically, in comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. In the lead up to recording this podcast, you spoke a bit about brown discounts and green premiums. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what they are and how they might factor in the future.
Yeah, I think it's difficult at the moment to see exactly how the sort of sustainability element will impact on the value of property. I think everybody is clear in the mind that it will have a positive impact, but it's not clear at the moment as to whether the really sustainable properties will become a prime property and move ahead of the kind of the existing stock in the market, or whether they will just become at the forefront and the less sustainable buildings will fall away. So I suppose it's that, will it be a green premium and those properties will push ahead, or will there just be a discount or a brown discount against the less sustainable properties? And what you'll probably find is that those maybe won't let as quickly at the same level of rent, and then will not then, once they're let up, have the same level of investor interest in them. So I think it's early days as yet. I don't think there's been enough in the market to clarify exactly which way it's going to go. At the moment, the only evidence coming through appears to be that sustainable buildings will let quicker, but there's no kind of data around, is there going to be any higher rents or premium rents attached to them, or any yield adjustment around sustainability. But I think the one telling factor that we're hearing is, some of the more progressive funds are looking at the whole life cycle of a property. So what they're looking at is they might be acquiring it now, but they're looking at, the Paris Agreement trajectory for net zero carbon, and they're plotting their investments against, well, where does that property sit against that cycle? And if that building is only on that trajectory for the next 5 years, they're factoring in a large-scale intervention, in their acquisition of that they're going to have to come and revisit that in a number of years to keep that building on the trajectory. And as we talked about earlier, coming back to retrofit things, in particularly multi-let occupied buildings, is difficult. It's quite invasive works potentially, depending on what you're looking at doing. So I think it is telling at the moment that that is coming, the green premium or the brown discount. I think the other thing that's important as well is, I think in the property industry, we get very caught up on pounds per square foot. The rent is pounds per square foot, the service charge is running at X pounds per square foot. I think if you speak to the end user, if you speak to the occupier, they don't work in that world. What they want to know is, what are my total occupational costs? So what there may be a situation is where, if you can prove that a more sustainable building, has lower energy consumption, and therefore, their occupational costs will be lower because of that, they can occupy it more efficiently. You'll probably be then being able to talk to people around moving to these buildings because overall their occupational costs are lower. So that factor between what is service charge or occupational cost versus, the rent that they'll pay, could fade away into the background, and you are talking about more just lower overall occupational costs for more sustainable buildings, which is obviously a positive factor for occupiers when they're kind of factoring that into their choices of where they choose to locate their offices.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So much to consider and so much to factor in. It's good to hear that, investors and funders are already on that journey. Let's move on then and talk about Ireland a little bit before we finish. Lee, just want to give us a brief synopsis of what that scheme is, what it entails, and then we'll bring Paul in as well to talk a little bit about his role in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Ireland is our latest office project. We recently gained planning consent. It's 100,000 square foot new build office building on John Dalton Street, just close to the town hall and in Manchester city centre. So we've already touched on, we've kind of been looking at the net zero carbon credentials of the building. So we had a look at it on two fronts, really, I suppose. The embodied carbon, so the carbon debt that is accumulated through the construction of the building. So we did have a look at things like low carbon concrete and CLT, so timber elements to the frame. We did come up against challenges with that. I think some of that technology is still yet to be adopted across the industry. So I think there is still a factor in the industry around adopting those new technologies. So people tend to price risk into that. It can be, you know, I know people on the cross-laminated timber have had challenges around insurance. I think they will be overcome. The drive towards lowering carbon, embodied carbon, you know, I think it's 60% of the total carbon a building creates is within its initial construction. So there's huge steps forward that can be made by reducing the embodied carbon. And I think as more developers demand those products and that, you know, research and development in those areas, you'll find huge step forwards in that, where there's more adoption in the construction industry. It becomes more commonplace and therefore becomes sort of accepted and not sort of a new phenomenon. So we had a look at certain elements. What we managed to do on Ireland, we had a look at actually reducing the structure. You know, stating the obvious, if you have a look at where the embodied carbon is, it's in the physical manifestation of the building. So we had a look at how could we reduce the amount of steel in the structure. So we were able to do that by the introduction of columns potentially into parts of the floor plate. So we were able to reduce the steel and therefore the embodied carbon in that element. We investigated the services zone. So again, the area in which the M&E is located, you know, historically it has a certain depth. So we squeezed that quite hard, and you know, we pushed our professional team, including Cundall's, quite hard on, well, what is that zone that's needed for that? You know, can that be done in a more efficient way? And therefore, you know, are we able to actually reduce the structure which we're producing? So we had a look at recycling some of the materials from the buildings which are on the site at the moment, but unfortunately, we're unable to do so. The buildings are quite inefficiently laid out, quite fragmented occupations, 3 separate buildings. So we weren't able to recycle any of the materials. But what we did do is we're able to introduce some recycled materials in the new build elements of the scheme. So, for example, we're using recycled aluminium in the window frames, which has enabled us to reduce the carbon created in construction.
Interesting what you said about the technologies, the low carbon technologies. You know, if you're demolishing what's on the site and building again, you want to keep that down, that embodied carbon. But as you said, some of that technology is not readily available, or it's prohibitively expensive. Paul, tell me about your experience working on this project, and touch on as well those kinds of low carbon technologies and when you envisage them becoming commonplace in the industry.
Well, I think what was great about this project was that 2.5 years ago, before anyone had heard of neighbours and the term net zero carbon wasn't really being discussed greatly, we were able to present the topic and enjoyed a client that was happy to sit up and listen. And we have the benefit of having a number of Australian offices, and the neighbours scheme started 10 years ago in Australia. It was brought in by the Australian government and became a mandatory thing to use on all government buildings, and it drove down their energy over that 10-year period by 75%. So it was a proven thing, and that was, as I say, adopted by the UK. The Design for Performance methodology uses the same approach. And so, you know, we've gone on this journey together of trying to drive this project to be, you know, a very low carbon consuming building. And that includes embodied carbon in construction, the operational carbon. But, you know, Lee mentioned, you know, we looked at cross-laminate timber. Well, to get a stable timber floor, you still need to put a concrete screed on top of it. And then at the end of the use of the building, it's impossible to reuse that timber because it's covered in concrete. You can't separate the two. So, you know, we're sort of learning all of these things about what seems like a good idea actually in the whole life of the building might not be. So, you know, we've managed to get ourselves in a position where our embodied carbon is, you know, it's very low. There's a 2030 challenge that the RIBA have produced, and you've got the LETI, which is the London Energy Transformation Initiative group, that have set embodied carbon targets. There's various industry sort of guides towards this, not legislation, but guides. And you know, we are probably 5 years ahead of those targets on average with the embodied carbon. And then with the operational carbon, the energy that you use to heat and light the building, for example, we're a 5.5 star target neighbours rating. So that's a very, very challenging thing to achieve, really, because the Australians took 10 years. They've got very few 6-star buildings, even now after 10 years. And, the UK being the competitive animals that we are, we want to jump straight to 6-star. And, it's very challenging. A 6-star building would mean some major habit changes or experience changes for the occupier,
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, Paul, because I know, Lee, this is something that you're quite passionate about, and you put all this effort into making a net zero building, and then you hand it over. In order to keep it net zero, I suppose you've got to adapt behaviours of occupiers. Do you want to talk a little bit about that just before we wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we're conscious of is that the neighbours rating is all around occupational energy. We are very cognizant that 80% of the building is occupied by our customers, our occupiers. So whilst we can design a very efficient building that can use or be very sustainable in operation, really we need those occupiers to come on that journey with us. If they're in control of 80% of the building, they will obviously have a major impact on its energy consumption. So one of the things that we're looking at through neighbours is, well, how do we operate the building efficiently? So things like, do we centrally control systems around the hours of operation of a building? Do we have a centrally controlled hours of operation and systems like the heating and the cooling system? Do we set parameters during certain hours, and then out of those hours, customers don't have the ability to have building-wide systems running where there's only a few of them in occupation, because obviously that's a very inefficient way of controlling energy within a whole building. So I think, as Paul hinted at there are some occupational changes that people will have to come on, or organisations will have to come on a journey with us to hit these targets. So I think the other important thing as well, it's visibility. I think it's important that in these buildings, if we're able to provide or capture and provide data on energy consumption to individual organisations within the building, they then have visibility of what that looks like, maybe how they are performing, against their neighbours in the building, and also how the building is performing as a whole. And I think if you can kind of harness that sort of community feel and get people on board and on that journey with you in terms of energy consumption, that's a really powerful message, and really will sort of pull through into what the building achieves as a whole. So the good thing around that is, you're able to then sort of demonstrate to people how they, as an occupier, can impact on the wider piece in terms of the building as a whole. The other thing that we're looking at as well to try and inform behaviour is we're going to produce a design guide for fit out, because what we are nervous about is, obviously, if we design some really efficient base build systems in the building that are designed to operate in a certain way, and then customers come in and obviously they want to do their own fit out and put their own stamp on the space, which is fine. But we just need to make sure that we are monitoring how those systems are being adapted and making sure that efficiency isn't lost through modification. So we're looking at doing that through a design guide for fit out. And I think the other element as well that we touched on earlier was that neighbours, it's a continued monitoring framework. So effectively the building is monitored at 12 monthly periods in terms of its energy efficiency. So it's not as straightforward as, you complete the building, you gain your accreditation or your star rating, and then you kind of left to your own devices. It is an ongoing assessment. So what it does is it enables us to monitor the performance of the building going forward and potentially fine tune its performance as well. If there are elements that, either weren't perfected at PC or at completion of the building, or there are changes in occupation, maybe, through time, the way people occupy the space or certain customers in the building have an impact on the energy efficiency. It allows us to react to those and continue to fine tune its performance throughout its life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very important point, isn't it? It's an ongoing thing. It's not just a case of practical completion wash your hands of it. It's an ongoing battle, and it's one that we have to fight together. Paul, Lee, thank you so much for your time and for a fascinating conversation on this topic. And I hope the listeners can join us next time for the Next Place Northwest COP26 podcast. Thank you very much.